Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us through this episode of Independent Thought. So, Claudia, before we went on the break, we were talking about education and the different ideas that you had for that. And, the question that I really want to ask you now is, what was the moment in your life that politically activated you? I know that for a lot of different people, it can be, something that happened, maybe in high school or maybe after college. I know for a lot of people, they got activated in 2016 watching Bernie Sanders come to rise. But, what was it for you that made you more or less get politically tuned in?
So I know that I mentioned this before, like in our pre-little meeting, but I have always been into politics. I do not know why. No one in my family knows why either. But I've always wanted to make a difference in the world and through people's lives, and I always thought the best means of that was government. However, I think a lot of what really impacted me was just what I lived and the stories that were told to me from my family as I was growing up. So, for example, the reason I'm super passionate about farm workers and having a farm workers bill of rights is I slightly mentioned that my family, I come from a line of farm workers. But I grew up with my mom telling me stories, and to this day, um, and I'm sure that she suffered a little bit of PTSD from this, about how when her and my grandmother and my tios and tias would be out picking cotton or citrus or corn, how they would have pesticides sprayed over them, and there was no sort of warning. It happened. Um, and about how they weren't allowed to have bathroom breaks. So, I mean, she specifically remembers about this one time in a citrus orchard, that she went, and she was about 5 or 6 years old, and had to go super badly. And she remembers asking if she could go to the bathroom. And they said, no, you either pee on yourself or pee in the field. And so she decided to go and squat behind an orange tree, and she went to the bathroom out there. And she said she remembers she got a leaf and used that to wipe herself down. But I mean, just as a child, just the amount of impact that has on you is just unbeknownst to me. But and the sad thing is that it doesn't stop there. She continued. My family, we don't come from money, and so they had to continue this work all the way up until people left for college or the military. So my mom, when she was in high school, talks about how when she started her period, and they were still doing this farm work, they still did not allow for bathroom breaks, and we were too poor to afford any menstrual products. Um, and so she had to literally free bleed all over herself, and how she would run to a different part of the field and try turning her underwear inside out to try to make sure that one side was not more bloody than the other, and just trying to clean herself up. And it hurts my heart knowing that my mom and my aunts had to live through that. And it upsets me to think that that is very likely, and I can almost say it with 100% certainty that it's continuing to happen now. Um, there is no reason why people should be so degraded, and just looked upon, as being so less than human, that you have to pee in a field or free bleed all over yourself, that they can't even allow you to go to the freaking restroom. So I am very, very passionate about working class folks, and especially farm workers. I'm My grandfather, maybe about the age of 9, where I is another, I guess, touch point where I kind of realized wow, we need to do something. I need to do something, anything. Um, he was diagnosed with, I can't remember the name of the type of stomach cancer, but he was diagnosed with stomach cancer when I was about 9 years old. And like I mentioned, I come from a very, very poor like very, very poor family. And he made the choice to live in hospice, or I guess like die in hospice, rather than go to MD Anderson Hospital in Houston and receive the life-saving treatment for his cancer that was very treatable, all because he didn't want to put my family in any sort of medical debt, because he just didn't know how we would be able to go after it. He didn't want to be a burden to our family after he died. And so I'm like, I could literally start crying right now, because it just, how can we live in a world where that is okay? Where millions of people make the choice to not get treatment because of the expense. So these very easily treatable things then snowball into these larger medical issues that end up taking their lives. It is, my family and my experiences are my driving force. They have shaped me, and I am a fighter. I am a fighter. So while these stories are, they hurt, and there's like, a lot of pain that's there, that exists, I carry them with me and I use them as fuel. Because over my dead freaking body will I allow this to happen to anyone else. Point blank.
Hey, I appreciate that. I appreciate the passion. Honestly, I mean, there are so many people who are suffering around the country, and their voices go largely ignored for a variety of reasons. And, I think one of those reasons is because, we have so many kind of like restrictions in place that kind of keep people in power who currently are in power. And so I kind of wanted, the next thing I want to talk to you about is about like voting rights. You're in Texas right now, and there have been some people on the local level who have been going after voting rights there, but we're not just seeing it in Texas, we're seeing it all over the country. We saw it in Georgia, we've seen it in other states as well. What exactly do you believe should be done on a national level to address voting inequities, so that maybe hopefully we can get some politicians who are a little more obstinate out of Congress? I think you mentioned that the representative in your current district, it might be one of those people.
Yes. So I think that when we look at when our Constitution was written and who was written by, it was written by white men who are my age or younger. I'm 27 right now. And I think roughly folks were between like the ages of like 23 and 27. And that's who wrote the Constitution that our lives are built upon. And the reason for that is because it needs to be, and they've always meant for it to be, a young electorate, a young, vibrant electorate that's making these decisions, and coming up with fresh, new, creative ways in order to basically preserve our democracy. As in terms of voting rights, I believe that we 100% need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I also know that we have the For the People Act, which includes just a slew of policies that I think would very much help protect the sanctity of democracy, but at the same time empower more people of color and working class people to actually be able to utilize their voices. Because we're in a redistricting year, I want to talk about gerrymandering. So TX35 as written was actually found illegal by the Supreme Court, but it was, I forget what the reason was why we couldn't go back and undraw it, but there was a reason why we couldn't go back and redraw it. But TX35 as it's shaped is illegal. And the reason that we're able to have seats like this is not solely just a one side, it's not solely just a conservative issue. It's an issue that exists amongst Democrats and Republicans. There are backroom deals that are made all the time across party lines in order to make sure that those who are in power preserve that power. And those who have been working by each other's sides for decades continue to work by each other's sides for decades because they look out for one another. The incumbent who represents TX35 is Congressman Lloyd Doggett. And while maybe decades ago, because he's been serving in Congress in Central Texas since 1995, which I was 1 year old at that time. He may have at one point properly represented the folks within this area. However, the demographics have shifted drastically. And so for someone to hold on to their seat for almost over 2 decades without actually doing anything to fight for it or to honor it, we need term limits.
We need term limits.
I'm 100% am supportive of term limits. And while that might seem kind of like backwards in the sense like, why would you run for Congress, but also impose term limits on yourself? Is because I'm not a selfish jerk. I completely understand that we need to help pave the way for newer and fresher ideas, that it shouldn't be something where the seats do not belong to people, they belong to the people. There's a big difference. So there's a lot of folks that I like to call them Dixiecrats, because let's face it, that's what they are, within the district, who are older and predominantly white, who tend to get mad and get very, very defensive when I say that I'm running against Lloyd Doggett.
Oh.
And so people can get really, really fired up very easily. But the thing is, I don't believe that any blue will do. I believe that we need people who are representative of us, of the constituency, but also that are going to fight for it, and make sure that they use their seat and wield it to actually do things with it. I think that people receive way too much praise for playing the defense instead of playing good offense. I constantly think that, and I even have like my own little bit about like the Texas Democrats and their leave to DC and coming back and stuff. I believe that for some of them, there's a little way too much praise for playing the defense. It's like, yes, of course, if you're Democrat and you're just, like a basic good human being, you're going to stand up for the least of us, right? Like you're going to advocate for trans kids, you're going to advocate for voting rights, you're going to advocate for healthcare. Of course you're going to do those things. That's the bare minimum, right? But if you're also within these positions of power, what are you also doing with that? How are you helping the cause by actually producing legislation? To me, I think that's the most important reason why we have elected officials, is because they're supposed to be the ones that are not only representing us, but also bringing about policy. So if you don't breed policy, then it's like, what the hell are you there for?
That is a great question. And before we kind of transition away from voting rights, I do want to reference that, speaking about this, we also talked about, you had the belief that incarcerated people should be able to vote. Now, this is a topic that I don't hear a whole lot. So why is it important in your eyes that people who are currently incarcerated should still retain their ability to vote while in jail?
So there's kind of like a two-parter thing that I guess two-parter policy positions that I have. But in regards to being able to vote while still incarcerated, all the time we talk about rehabilitation, right? And about what the re-entering to society looks like, and how supposedly after being in jail or being in prison, you're supposed to all of a sudden be this like new changed person because, you know, being beaten down and locked up is supposed to make you like see the light, and make you become like this great member, productive, like to society, and you're never going to do a bad thing again, right? That's the perceived idea of what it is that prisons and jails do. However, we do nothing for people while they are incarcerated to help them maintain some sort of sanctity or dignity in order to help be those productive members of society. And a lot of the times, not having the right to vote, which I think is like one of your basic, right? Like one of your basic human rights. Um, I believe that folks who are incarcerated should be able to have some buy-in as to who it is that represents them, because there are progressive folks such as myself or progressive organizations, like I'm thinking about here within like the my district, like Mano Amiga or Austin Justice Coalition, who fight for incarcerated individuals' rights all the time. And there are local leaders and state level and federal level leaders who want to make change and empower incarcerated individuals, but it's just not getting enough traction because commonly prisons are located in your more rural areas, which are going to be predominantly red, predominantly conservative. And so I believe that you need to allow people to have their voice heard. Now, the second part to that is not, it has to do with like counting on where the vote is coming from per se. For example, because we're in a redistricting year, there is an issue regarding how to determine on the census, how to figure out and how to count incarcerated peoples. Do you count them as being within the district where they are housed, or will they where they will be returning to, like where they're from? And right now it's currently counted as where they're housed. So like, for example, like in Huntsville here in Texas, we have a prison. And so everyone that's incarcerated there, those census numbers go towards the Huntsville area census data. And census data is used in order to redraw maps. It's used in order to write policy. It's used to budget. It is used like in every which way that you can think of.
Right.
And so I believe that we should do away with that and really look at where the community, like look at where these pipelines are, because I mean, we talk about like the pipelines to prison all the time. And after that, it's like after we talk about like the pipelines to prison, we always talk about like, these are the ways that we can mitigate it. And these are things that we can do to help curb that pipeline. However, I believe that a lot of the activist conversation stops there. And it doesn't go to, okay, well, once someone is incarcerated, what are different things that we can do as a society to help empower and uplift these folks to actually have the ability to be productive members of society, and have that second chance whenever they're released, and have that second chance to come back home to an area that has different resources, that practices restorative justice. So yes, I definitely believe that we need to end the gerrymandering, census counting incarcerated peoples in their area. And I believe that incarcerated folks should have the right to vote.
Okay. And, I think that, too often, when we have this conversation, it feels like it always gets just, like bogged down with the whole like, oh, well, they're in jail, so why do you care about their rights, so on and so forth. And that dehumanizing language can actually translate to people afterwards. You see people still don't have their rights when they get out of jail, probation, parole. And then, it feels like it might take forever for some of these people to ever get their rights back. So I do appreciate your stance on this. I think one of the last questions I want to ask you today, is again, kind of more or less focused on, where you're at in Texas. I know that, in the southern states, the topic of immigration comes up even more so than it does anywhere else in the country. You had mentioned that you wanted to see immigration reform, and you spoke about Title 42. Can you
Yeah.
tell the audience a little bit about what Title 42 is, and like what your stance on immigration reform is?
Okay. So, um, in terms of Title 42, Title 42 is I forgot what exactly the word for it is, but it's more like a health order. And I believe it came from like the Health and Human Services under the Trump administration. Um, in Title 42 is currently still in place. Immigrant rights activists are calling on the Biden administration to rescind it, but there is no word on whether or not that is moving. It likely will not move, because no matter how blue some people may be, they just do fail to act on immigrants' rights issues. Um, Title 42 allows for folks to be denied entry regardless of whatever it is the reason. So even if you are an asylum seeker, people tend to think, okay, asylum seekers, there is a path for folks in order to apply for asylum here within the United States. However, Title 42 was proposed on was I guess released during the Trump administration, whenever COVID first hit,
Right.
and it's basically an excuse to keep people, even asylum seekers, like I said, out of the United States, and gives folks who are working like Border Patrol the right and customs, the right to deny folks entry to the United States based on this preconceived notion that they would pose a health concern for bringing over COVID into the United States. We have seen time and time again since Title 42 came out that there is no such data that says that this is true. There is nothing backing that up. Health and Human Services, the new secretary, Secretary Barrera, who just was put into place by the Biden administration, even came out and said, I don't know why it is that we have Title 42. We have no data, no collection that is backing up the fact that supposedly immigrants are bringing in and leading to COVID spikes along the border.
Right.
So we are calling on, and I will continue to call on the Biden administration to rescind Title 42, because I believe, this to date number may be like a little out of touch, but the last time that I looked at it was in like towards the end of July, and it has allowed for over 170,000 people, which includes like families and children, to be denied entry or asylum at the border, which then feeds into this entire GOP driven narrative that we do have a border crisis and that it's terrible. And it's like, yes, we do have a crisis, but it's more of like a humanitarian. It's more of like a humanitarian crisis, because people are trying to come in for terms of safety. They're fleeing what different insurrections that they may be having, like in South America, or cartel issues that are going on within Mexico. And we need to welcome folks with open arms. I would not be here if my grandma had not crossed over illegally in the 60s. I would not exist. And I would like to think that me and my family are working, productive members of society. And so I believe that we need to rescind Title 42. We need to codify DACA so that way dreamers are protected by law. I believe that in terms of like immigration reform, it's so nuanced, and there's so many different like policies built in within like the blanket umbrella term of like immigration reform.
Yeah.
But I would say starting with prioritizing kind of like an immediate citizenship pathway, like I'm talking like month to month pathway process for folks who worked during all of like the pandemic. So that includes like your farm workers, that includes your frontline workers who worked at grocery stores, who've worked in restaurants, whether it's like back of the house, front of the house. That includes folks like who are doctors, who are nurses, who are here, and that are not citizens. And it prioritizes giving them citizenship because there's no way that we would have survived without them.
Absolutely. And I thank you for bringing like some light to this issue, because it feels like right now, kind of where we're at in our political cycle, it seems like the news has been dominated by, one or two things, right? And these
Mhm.
are, the coronavirus pandemic is a very important topic to be talking about on a day in and day out basis, but it also feels as though the news is almost exclusively talking about that. And meanwhile, all these other issues are more or less getting swept underneath the rug. So thank you for taking a moment to speak about it. If people want to learn more about your campaign, like where can they learn more about you? Like where can they find you online?
Definitely. So my website is www.conclaudia.com. So that is CONCLAUDIA.com. Translated to English, that just means with Claudia. I don't like the regular like Claudia for Congress or like and then all of my social media is at Poder con Claudia. So that is PODERCONCLAUDIA. And I am on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. It's hard keeping up with all of those, but I am on all of those all the time. And on my website, that's where you can find information on how to volunteer or just stay up to date with receiving newsletters on what it is that I do in the community, because I am first and foremost an activist and community organizer and politician, maybe second or third.
And I guess lastly, like when is the primary election in Texas?
So, it depends on how the maps are redrawn. So,
Okay.
I know that it is slated to have a March 5th, 2022 primary election date. However, because maps are being drawn so late in the process, and there is likely going to be some court fighting, and we're going to have to wait on what courts state. Um, my team is looking at the primary being in late May or early June.
Okay. Well, we will try to stay up to date with that as more information comes out. Claudia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really do appreciate you coming on here and talking to all of us about your platform and your issues. And if anyone is interested in learning more about your campaign, just go ahead and click in the episode description right now. There'll be some links in the description that you can click on, and you can go check in with Claudia and her run for the 35th or maybe different district of Texas. We'll see. We'll see. But thank you again for coming on. Everyone else, we'll be right back after this quick break with my final thoughts of the day. Stay tuned.